California Task Force to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans. Content warning. It contains discussions of racial discrimination, sexual assault, torture, lynching, and other forms of extreme violence. Contains unedited historical quotations and photographs of white supremacist hatred, torture, lynching, autopsy, and other forms of graphic violence.
Legal segregation laws not only confined black workers in the South, but also impacted the economy of the entire country. 137 segregation pitted workers of different races against one another, resulting in continued of opportunity for black workers and less collective power for workers of all races. 138 unions have a lengthy history in the United States as craftsmen have long joined together to solve problems related to their craft. 139 in the 18th century, strikes, labor organizing. Collective bargaining developed at the same time, and the first authenticated strike was called in 1786 by Philadelphia printers. 140 unions reached their peak. World War II, as unions grew at the rate of approximately 1 million workers per year. 141. Prior to World War II, many unions refused to accept black people as members. 142 Since before the Civil War, white workers have claimed that black workers were not suited to skilled labor in order to avoid competition for jobs. 143 In the North, unions did not hire black workers because white workers refused to work beside them, and for the sake of morale, the companies and unions would not force the issue. 144 White workers sometimes walked off the job to force their employers to rid their workplace of black employees. 145 Throughout the 19th century, trade unions organized by white workers typically excluded black workers. In 1902, black workers scarcely made up 3% of members in unions. 146 In response to exclusion, black workers sometimes formed their own unions. 147 For example, in 1869, delegates attended the Colored National Labor Union Convention in Washington, D.C., which was a counterpart to the White National Labor Union. 148 Action sometimes supported labor unions' discrimination against black workers. 149 For example, when the city of St. Louis built a segregated hospital for black patients, union members protested the hiring of a single black tile setter. 150 The city fired the contractor and committed not to hire any contractor that employed black workers. 151 Legal segregation both reflected and intensified racial tension between workers. Segregation made contact between black and white workers almost impossible. That black and white workers would inhabit different worlds and making labor organizing across racial lines more dangerous and less likely to occur. 152 Legal segregation not only held down the wages of black working-class Americans, also prevented working-class white workers from demanding higher pay, as long as black workers could always be forced to work for less. 153 Confederation of Labor, founded in 1886 and survived today by the AFL-CIO, initially strived for racial equality. 154 As leaders recognized the value of a united working class. 155 However, legal segregation in the South proved to be too influential and Federation leadership allowed local affiliates to exclude black workers. 156 Workers protested exclusion throughout the 1920s. 157 and 1930s. 158 Federation's leader's formal response was that the Federation did not discriminate, human nature cannot be altered, and black individuals ought to be grateful for what the Federation had done for them. 159 have argued that legal segregation discouraged white and black workers from working together for better working conditions and fostered a racial division that served the interests of Southern planters and industrialists. 160 For example, beginning in the 1880s, and white tenant farmers and sharecroppers began to join biracial political parties to challenge the political and business elite of the South. 161 Scholars such as Jacqueline Jones, who testified before the task force, that legal segregation and private racial discrimination were used to disrupt this burgeoning biracial political force. 162 Prior to World War II, many unions refused to accept black people as members. Since before the Civil War, white workers have claimed that black workers were not suited to skilled labor in order to avoid competition for jobs. Fourth, companies and unions did not hire black workers because white workers refused to work beside them, and for the sake of morale, the companies and unions would not force the issue. White workers sometimes walked off the job to force their employers to rid their workplace of black employees. 132. Chapter 10. Labor and hindered opportunity. Example, before the Civil War, black women, men, and children worked in the South. After the war, Southern textile mill owners reserved those jobs for white families, and advertised hazardous mill work as a welcome escape from sharecropping. 163. This drove a wedge between the black and white rural poor. 164. From occupational licenses. Also played a part in how states excluded black workers from skilled, higher-paying jobs through what eventually became state licensure laws. A license from a state entity is required to practice some professions and trades, like electricians and doctors. 165. State, and sometimes local, governments design these licensing requirements so that black workers are less likely to qualify, which has intensified the impact of discrimination by private employers and unions. 166. Licensure systems worked in parallel to exclusion by unions and professional societies. 167. In a way that has been described by scholars as particularly effective in excluding black workers from skilled, higher-paid jobs. 168. White craft unions implemented unfair tests exclusively by white examiners to exclude qualified black workers. 169. Across the country from the late 1890s through the late 1930s, state laws allowed local mayors or city councils to appoint the members of the licensing board for plumbers. 170. This meant that the local plumbers' unions could exert significant influence over who sat on the licensing board. 171. From there, the boards barriers to avoid licensing black plumbers, such as requiring a union apprenticeship, from which black individuals were banned, before an applicant could even qualify to take a licensing exam. 172. Other barriers included a high school diploma. It was more difficult for black workers due to education discrimination, as discussed in Chapter 6, separate and unequal education, passing a personal interview conducted by a white person, or sometimes, even false test scores. 173. Methods, which were used by other professions as well. 174. Did not ban black workers outright because these statutes were outwardly neutral. Repeatedly found that they were constitutional without questioning the discriminatory motives and impact. 175. A few courts recognize the dangers of allowing licensing boards to control entry into the profession, but not enough to stem the tide. 176. Government support made the discrimination worse. In Virginia, a white plumber explained his state's law requiring members of the plumbers' union be part of the licensing board. T.P. Negro is a factor in this section. The enclosed Virginia state plumbing law will entirely eliminate him and the imposter from following our craft. 177. By 1924, 24 states and Puerto Rico had similar laws in place. 178. Were effective. 179. In 1973, Montgomery County, Alabama had only one licensed black plumber, who, despite having spent 4 years studying the trade, told he failed the local exam each time he took it. He was not allowed to see his exam papers or told what his score was. He was finally able to obtain a local license after passing the state master plumber's exam. 180. North Carolina, similarly, had only one black plumber in 1968, and in Maryland in 1953, only 2 of 1,200 licensed plumbers were black. 181. The impact of these exclusionary efforts is still felt today. In 2021, the Bureau of Labor Statistics estimated that 87.2% of plumbers are white and only 7.1% are black. 182. Of licensure to regulate jobs increased dramatically after the 1950s, when only 5% of professions required licensure in the United States. 183. In 2018, 2021 8% of professions required licensure 184. Some of the reasons for this increase include trying to professionalize and legitimize certain jobs and an overall growth of fields that have historically required licensure 185. Regardless of the reason, one result of the growth is that discriminatory licensing standards have become more widespread. Even if these standards did not intend to exclude black workers, the result was exclusion. One such method today is the bans on licensure for people with criminal records. In Chapter 12, Mental and Physical Harm and Neglect, state and federal governments have criminalized African Americans throughout our nation's history. African Americans being more likely to have criminal records without necessarily committing crimes at higher rates than other races or ethnicities. 186 Race discrimination and disproportionality in the criminal justice system thus combine with laws like those excluding persons with criminal involvement from licensure to close off avenues for work. Difficult for people with criminal records, who are disproportionately black, to find jobs, even if their records are old or have little to do with the job. They have demonstrated rehabilitation 187 when a license is required. Those challenges can become insurmountable. One 2016 study showed that there were 27,254 state occupational licensing restrictions against people with criminal records nationwide, 1,269 of which involve restrictions on licensure for people with any type of felony conviction and 6,372 of which involve restrictions for people with misdemeanor convictions. 188 19,786. Restrictions were lifetime bans and 11,338 were mandatory and allowed no discretion by the board. 189 in some instances, upon release, formerly incarcerated persons cannot work in the very professions for which prison job rehabilitation programs trained them. 190 For example, many prisons provide training programs. Laws in every state prevent a formerly incarcerated person from working as a barber. 191. Efforts have begun to reform these criminal record exclusions. 192 Several states have now passed laws to revise licensing restrictions related to people's criminal records. 193 But thousands of restrictions still remain. A database funded by the United States Department of Justice shows that there are 12,989 consequences of having a criminal record for various licenses nationwide. 194.